Good afternoon to all, and welcome to Seminar 11 of Year 3 of our Maximos Seminar. We're with the volume on difficulties in sacred scripture. The responses to Thalassios by Maximos the Confessor. We're looking at questions 34 through 36 today, 34, 35, and 36, which are only, again, a handful of pages, but Maximus gives us a great deal. Pages 210 through 217. Questions 34 through 36, pages 210 through 217. The themes today are, we're continuing with the theme of dwelling and calling. So dwelling as calling, or calling and dwelling. That's the first theme. The second theme, or kind of pair, is horizon and synthesis. Horizon and synthesis. And then thirdly, the idea of gift and communion. So dwelling as calling, horizon, synthesis, and gift and communion. But because one of our readings today has to do with the question of faith, and since we had it on our minds last time, let's begin there. This idea of faith. We said that faith is not identification with the gift or with part of the gift. It's not identification with the gift or part of the gift, but correspondence with the gift. And we kind of phrased it as an integral movement unto, an integral drawing near of the whole being unto the divine. So it's kinetic, but it's correspondence, not identification. Faith, then, means trust and intimate patience as well. Trust and intimate patience. Faith means trust because what we've described is essentially a stance. It's a stance. Faith is a stance. Or, to use the same term, but in a different form, David Goa likes to say faith is a disposition of the nous. Stance is the equivalent of disposition. One's Greek and one's Latin. A disposition of the nous. So faith is a stance. It also means enjoying the intimate rhythm of drawing near. It's an enjoyment of the rhythm of drawing near. Now, this drawing near, we can relate to groping. We spoke about groping last time too. Drawing near in terms of groping means feeling and partaking of the spiritual texture of what is nearby. That's part of a faithful stance, to feel and partake of things nearby. But drawing near also means gathering, to draw things near. And so faith is a gathering of our person into an integral stance. We're gathering ourselves in faith. Faith as gathering oneself means gathering oneself unto the integrity of the gift, for the sake of the integrity of the gift. That's why we're gathering ourselves. And by this we mean that faith is participative. We seek to be at one or as one with the truth revealed in the gift. We seek to be at one or as one with the truth of his own. And this holy integrity means or signifies our being as a living synthesis, our being as a living synthesis, our being as an integral gathering and gathering unto, gathering for the sake of. Our being as a living synthesis. And as we are gathering for the sake of, or gathering unto, or rather we are gathering for the sake of, or gathering unto simplicity. So unto, or for the sake of, are the movements at the heart of faith, unto or for the sake of. Simplicity for Maximus proves the culmination of our synthesis, our gathering. Simplicity proves the culmination of our gathering. So it's not gathering for its own sake. There's no idolatry of ascesis here. It's for the sake of holy simplicity. Simplicity is the fulfillment of relation, though, not its denial or rejection. Simplicity means the fulfillment of relation, not its denial or rejection. And so our gathering is apophatic. It's apophatic in that it involves neither self-idolatry, we don't idolize the act of gathering, nor disdain of the gift, nor do we disdain gathering once we have gathered. Our relation with gathering is apophatic. If we forget this, if we hasten towards simplicity, the result is inflation, spiritual inflation, rather than simplicity. If we hasten towards. This means if our gathering is self-idolatrous, gathering for its own sake, and then negated for its results, apparently simplicity, our being is hastening towards inflation, not drawing near to simplicity. That's why the movement has to be apophatic. Apophasis helps us avoid the first step of self-idolatry and then the second step of self-negation. So we're just contrasting for a moment simplicity and inflation. Inflation is not the fulfillment of relation. Inflation denies relation. It denies the other. It says this is absolute. And so spiritual inflation means one's own is divine, not one's own as his own. My own is mine own, capital M. Mine own is God's own, but God is me. One's own is divine. And in this case, or in this sense, inflation is anti-simple. Anti-simple. It looks like simplicity, but it's not. We have hastened and we have forgotten that our processes, our progress is apophatic. Inflation is anti-simple, like we understand the figure of Christ and Antichrist in the tradition, where Antichrist stands in for Christ. It's not the evil counterpart, which is clearly distinguished. It looks the same. Inflation can look like simplicity. Simplicity fulfills and heals relation via beauty, but it fulfills relation. And I think we can say that the relation between composition and simplicity, that which is composite and that which is simple, is accomplished via harmony, via harmonia. In that, in beautiful harmony, the composition becomes simple. The composite becomes beautiful in harmony. On the other hand, inflation obviates relation. There's no relation with just more of me, thus providing its own shadow line, i.e. up to the thing negated. If there's more of me, reality ends where I end. That is, inflation is ultimately a negative movement. It masquerades as simplicity, but it's ultimately destructive, the complete opposite. And if one depends upon the negation of another, like inflation depends upon negation of another. If one depends upon the negation of another, we have what Maximus calls doubt. This is from this is in question 33 in footnote 1. Our translator glosses doubt, diakrinin. It means via the separation, according to our translator. It's a nice way into it. So if one depends upon the negation of another, we have what Maximus calls doubt, and the word means via the separation. That is, one both denies and absolutely relies on the distinction or division. You negate, but then you depend on that negation for your own being. And this is the fundament of critique. I think that this speaks to what we termed in a recent session, disbelief in the symbol. Disbelief in the symbol. This stance of via the separation. It says that things are naturally apart rather than naturally belonging together. And it is really the stance of doubt or disbelief in the symbol, a dependence upon negation, and a turning around of Christ's commandment that we love our enemies. Disbelief in the symbol also means there's only meaning via the instance, via the individual, via the set apart, via the being as only. And this doubtful, critical stance is always ill-centered on the self. There's some kind of fear for the self, or some kind of certainty of the self, or as Maximus says, self-love, at the heart of this way of seeing, which wants to see via the separation. It needs to negate in order to be its own. So this doubtful, critical stance, which means disbelief in the symbol, which means disbelief in the meaning of things drawn together into a whole. We said, we noted last time that one way of glossing belief is to say it means to be linked by life and love. Be linked by life and love. So disbelief means not knowing how to be linked via life and love. That's what disbelief means. They don't know how to be linked. Disbelief in the symbol. The symbol. Let's return to the symbol just for a moment. Symbol and metaphor. Symbol means cast together or cast as one. And symbol proclaims that things are meaningful when gathered together under a new integral union. A union which in its fullness blesses each participant and their gathering. It doesn't disdain. It blesses each participant and their gathering. So symbol, things are cast together, things are cast as one. So the symbol is the movement of meaningful conjoining, meaningful coalescence. It means the movement unto new or renewed union in the truth of Christ. And in this sense, symbol depends on metaphor. Metaphor meaning movement of the gift. The essential movement of symbol is metaphor. The gift is given and then drawn near. Given and then drawn near. Metaphor may mean the movement of relation unto its fulfillment. It often clarifies or reveals how things become transformed in relation. I think metaphor clarifies or reveals how things become, or how one becomes transformed in relation. And by this we mean in a metaphor, a presence as or a being as gestures towards its fulfillment, its completion, in a presence of or a being of. And so to disregard metaphor and symbol means an idolatry of this here now. The being as is thickened into inert self-identity. So our being as becomes complete in terms of its rendering of the gift unto the divine giver. One's own or our own becomes his own. But this movement of completion lies beyond time. Maximus teaches us that our synergy with God begins before we know time or even know our own being. Our synergy begins before we know time or we know our own being. And so correspondence thus means that as we come to know our being in synergy, it's a gift beyond us, but as we come to know our being in synergy, we deepen our metaphors and draw our symbols into the clearing of Christ. We begin to correspond in faith, correspond with our stance to the synergy that our being is. Now, just thinking about the incarnation and thickening for half a second. As we correspond with the gift, remember that's faith, correspondence with the gift, our being as is clearly integrated with our being of. Being as human is clearly integrated with our being of God or of the divine. So correspondence with the gift, faith, means never giving into an idolatry of our being as. Our being as. If we have being as alone, all of our thickening, the incarnate moments, become potentially illusory or deceptive or for their own sake. And in this case, we have dwelling without calling, or place without movement, or inertia. With our being as alone, we have dwelling without calling, inertia. And dwelling without calling does not know the clearing of Christ, either as place or as movement. It's inert. Or, if we have our being as, presence as, alone, we have calling without dwelling. If dwelling without calling is inertia, calling without dwelling is desire without ground. That is passion. Calling without dwelling means no horizon, no sense of horizon. However, our reality is our calling as dwelling and our dwelling as calling. We need to hold both as one. And by this we mean, as with ever-moving repose, our movement is to be gathered to. Right? Our movement is to be gathered to, gathered and offered. So our calling is of our dwelling, and our dwelling is of our calling. Our way of phrasing this has been, mine own is his own. We could expand that phrase slightly, extend it, as Maximus says. Mine own logos is his own logos. And so as and of our being as and our being of become an integral apophatic is. Being as and being of, calling and dwelling together, become an apophatic is. And this means that our existence is not via the separation. We don't depend on it. We don't need negation, nor is our faith. Certainly not, well, assuredly not our faith. We are apophatically. Our existence is not based on negation. But we have our gift, well, two aspects. One is the forms of creation and their transformation, and the other part of the gift is the figures of creation and their transformation. Or, to put one way, the gift of creation and its completion in beauty. So creation is transformed in our loving gathering and offering unto God, whom we know as a communion of love. And all our own is drawn near and rendered whole in his own beyond time. That's our transformation. Our gift is also transfigured, though, the gift of our being and its completion in the cosmic liturgical hierarchy. And so our being is transfigured in loving communion. We transform creation by our loving gathering and offering, and our being is transfigured in loving communion. We are beings as communion and beings of communion, both being as and being of the truth of Christ. And so I think this is what part of what the truth of Christ means, or the horizon of Christ, or the clearing of Christ. It is also a metaphor for our healing or our wholeness, the movement of our gifts unto its own transformation and transfiguration in him as and of his own. And I strove to try to, how do we phrase this gift? What do we mean when we speak about the gift we are given? I think one way of phrasing the clearing or the gift of our infinitely loving Christ is that the gift means our participation and our almost witnessing. It's a participation which is almost a witnessing. But our participation in the synergetic transfiguration of our own unto his own. Our participation, which is almost a witnessing, in the synergetic transformation of our own unto his own. And the astonishingly beautiful thing is this is both given and fulfilled beyond our being. It's both given and fulfilled beyond our being. That's the gift. All right, let's hold those thoughts in mind and let's move into some reading and some close study of the text. David Goy, if I could ask you to please read question 34 and the response, the whole thing. It's just 2 pages, and then we'll have a few thoughts and then move on. Please, David. This is page 210, question 34. Go ahead.
What again is the meaning of, therefore I say unto you, all things you ask for when you are praying, believe that you have received them, and they will be yours. That's from the Gospel of Mark. How is it possible for someone to believe that he will receive absolutely whatever he asks for, when only God knows if what he is asking for is helpful or not? And if in ignorance he asks for something that is not helpful for him, how can God grant it to him? And if God does not grant him what is not helpful for him, and which he asks for in ignorance, how is it possible for someone to believe that he will receive whatever he asks for, and that it shall be so unto him? The response. All the difficulties in this heading have been resolved in summary fashion in the one that preceded it. Simply put, only those who have understood how they should believe know how they should pray, and in what manner and what kinds of things to ask for. For not all have knowledge, just as not all have faith. But the Lord, in saying, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness," that is, before all things, seek first the knowledge of truth, and then act in ways consistent with it, clearly showing that those who believe should seek divine knowledge alone, together with the virtue that adorns such knowledge through corresponding works. And because there are many things that believers must seek in order to acquire the knowledge of God, such as the deliverance from passions, patient acceptance of trials, the inner principles of the virtues, suitable modes of activities, the uprooting of the soul's proclivity for the flesh, the estrangement of sense perception from its condition of relation to objects of sense, the utter withdrawal of the intellect from all created things, and in general, everything that is required for the rejection of evil and ignorance and the acquisition of knowledge and virtue. It was only natural that the Lord said, "All things that you ask for in faith, you will receive." By all things, he was telling the pious that with true understanding and faith, they should seek only those things that tend toward the knowledge of God and the life of virtue. For it is assuredly these things that are beneficial, and the Lord assuredly gave them to those who asked for them. Whoever then, on account of his faith alone, that is, for the sake of unmediated union with God, asked for all the things that tend toward this union, will assuredly receive them. But whoever asks either for these things or for other things, being motivated by some other reason or cause, will not receive them, for he does not believe. And lacking faith, he is concerned with divine things for the sake of his own glory.
Thank you, David. Let's muse a little bit. The themes here seem to be circling around belief and asking and responding. But they also touch a concern that David has brought up, Bo has brought up more than once in the seminar, which is the issue of presumption. So that's partly there. The question and response are plainly about communication, what it means to communicate. And also then we remember that communicate has commune or communion at the center of it. Maximus is talking here about seeking, but we learn that seeking is not for what we have not. Gathering is the same energy as seeking. All truth is via communion. And so fulfillment here is merely the wholeness at or of the heart of our seeking and gathering. It's not about an object acquired. So the fulfillment of our seeking or our gathering has to do with the wholeness of its character. Another kind of way into that is to say here, Maximus is saying that our call is our response, and our response is our call. We are considering a spiritual stance here, not isolated acts of one direction or another direction. So calling and responding, just like co-responding, is one here. Also, with that in mind, it's not about an object gathered. He seemed to suggest that the telos of ascetic struggle, the telos of ascetic discipline, is not suppression or negation. So the heart of asceticism is not suppression, neither suppression nor negation, but rather a receptive stance, cleared for the truth of Christ to dwell, as it were. So our ascesis is part of our clearing, our struggle to clear and be receptive. And then just a little bit closer in on paragraph 34.3. He says, for it is assuredly these things, this is 34.3 on page 211, assuredly these things that are beneficial, and the Lord assuredly gives them to those who ask for them. So here, assuredly is not promising a thing, but it's indicating synergy. In other words, there's no certainty, but there's a stability of co-response. And then beneficial here, beneficial doesn't mean something we don't have which will help us now. It means our being, creation, rightly gathered in transformation. When we in creation participate in the transformation of Christ, it is all beneficial. All right, following on. Whoever then, on account of his faith alone, that is, for the sake of unmediated union with God. This phrase, for the sake of unmediated union, unmediated. Maximus has shown us 1 or 2 sessions ago that all of creation is being naturally transformed. He speaks of theosis as the common path. And so our transformation, which is the only true movement of a human being, is not for its own sake, but for the sake of unmediated union. But unmediated doesn't mean without form. It means transformed in communion. Right? We're not thinking about form and then no form, thing and then no thing and then God. We're getting away from that dualistic negation. So, whoever, on account of his faith alone, for the sake of unmediated union with God, asks for all the things that tend toward this union will assuredly receive them. The things that tend toward. Well, first of all, he's saying there are things. And second of all, he's saying things in relation have, as it were, their own inner movements or tendency. right? What he's saying is all of creation draws near in transformed beauty to God. Back to the text. For the sake of unmediated union with God, asks for all the things that tend towards this union will assuredly receive them. But whoever asks either for these things or for other things, being motivated by some other reason or cause, will not receive them, for he does not believe. So these things or other things. We partake of this drawing near by entering into loving relation with things as they are and of God, things as divine and things of the divine. But if these or other things become isolated, right, no matter what, if they become isolated, a form of being as alone, and we do this to things, we deform their relationship with God. If things become isolated, we have let's say mistaken our sense and interfered. And if we let them be in isolation, apart from relation, apart from their drawing near, then these or other things will not become part of our communion. And then just the last, and lacking faith, he is concerned with divine things for the sake of his own glory. So concerned with divine things, all of the right things, but for the sake of his own glory. His own glory. That means his own untransformed beauty, because creation is beautiful, but it's untransformed beauty. It is incomplete beauty. And if one's own is confined to one's own beauty, one's own glory, well then, as the scriptures say, one falls like lightning. All right. Let's move on to question 34. Michael, if I could ask you to please read the question and response. Oh, there are two Scholia here too. Pages 212 over to 214, please.
Question 35. Since the Logos became flesh, and not simply flesh, but blood and bones, and we are commanded to eat his flesh and drink his blood, but not to crush his bones, I would like to learn what is this threefold power of the Logos made man. Response. When the Logos, who transcends being and who is the creator of all beings, determined to enter into being in a manner known to himself alone, he bore within himself the natural logoi of all visible and intelligible beings, together with the incomprehensible forms of thought proper to his divinity. Of the former, the logoi of intelligible beings would be the blood of the Logos, while those of sensible beings can be understood as the visible flesh of the Logos. Moreover, insofar as the Logos is the teacher of the spiritual logoi that exist in both visible and intelligible realities, he gives those who are worthy, as if it were flesh to eat, the true understanding of the logoi found in visible realities in a manner that is appropriate to the recipients and consistent with reason. He likewise gives them, as if it were blood to drink, the knowledge of the logoi found in intelligible realities, which God's wisdom mystically prepared long ago in the bowl for mixing wine and in the sacrificial animals described in Proverbs. But he does not give his bones, that is, the logoi of his divinity, which transcend intellection, since they are equally and infinitely remote from every created nature, because the nature of beings possesses no state or condition on the basis of which it might be able to receive them. Again, the flesh of the Logos is true virtue. His blood is true knowledge, and his bones are ineffable theology. And there's a scholion here, which I'll read. Ineffable theology is absolute unknowing according to preeminence, which is unknown to us to the same extent that things naturally known to us fall within our knowledge. Back to the text. This is because, consistent with the manner of blood which in its appearance is changed into flesh, knowledge is transformed by ascetic practice into virtue, and after the manner of bones which are constitutive of blood and flesh, the logoi of his divinity, which transcend all intellection, exist within beings and create in a manner beyond our cognition the essences of those beings and preserve them in existence and are constituent for all knowledge and all virtue. But if someone were to say that the flesh and the blood are the logoi of judgment and providence, since at some point they will be entirely consumed and drunk, and that the bones are the ineffable logoi of divinity hidden within them, then it seems to me that he would not fall outside of what is likely to be true. But perhaps the flesh of the Logos is the perfect return and restoration of nature to itself through virtue and knowledge, and the blood is the future divinization which by grace will maintain nature in eternal well-being, while the bones are the unknowable power which itself that sustains human nature through the process of divinization in eternal well-being. If, however, someone were to say what is more readily grasped, namely that the flesh is voluntary mortification through the virtues, and blood is the perfection through death, resulting from tribulations for the sake of truth, and that the bones are the primary logoi concerning the divinity, which are inaccessible to us, he too would have spoken well, and in no way have fallen outside the proper meaning of things. I believe I skipped a logoi a few paragraphs back. I'll just read it. It was the beginning of paragraph 35.5. Blood here is used to indicate divinization, since it is the future life of those who will be made worthy of it. For blood is the symbol of life.
Thank you, Michael. Let's think a little bit, and then we'll move in closer to the first paragraph. The themes here. The themes, I don't know why, but the biblical phrase, stormy wind fulfilling his command, came to mind when I read the word command. It's a commandment which is curiously beyond us in grandeur. This is also about gift and fullness. This question and response. Overall, it's about communion, or how things are as one. And Maximus here is working with metaphor and logos, gift and metaphor. And he begins to clarify it, clarify the gift a little bit, moving from of to as, from logos to logoi. And I think that the relationship of logos and logoi, of and as, becomes clearer. We see that it is not one of certainty. It is not one of identity. It is not one of foreclosure or finality. Rather, Maximus presents, well, an image, an icon of a dance, our dance. We talk about dance often, the dance that gathers. He's doing it here. He's strolling around creation, delightedly acknowledging and affirming and celebrating and partaking of the gift of the logos here and here and here and here. And this whole dance is within the horizon of Christ, the truth of Christ. This is Christ as aletheia, Christ as clearing, giving in plenty. But to hone in a little bit on paragraph 35.2, some phrases there, really. He begins his response, when the Logos, who transcends being and who is the creator of all beings, determined to enter into being in a manner known to himself alone, and then he goes on. This truth, or this clearing, is a place of letting. Our response to this great mystery is to let it remain a beautiful mystery, not to probe or inquire, but to begin to partake of it. We don't hasten. That's the first. And then he continues, he bore within himself the natural logoi of all visible and intelligible beings. He bore within himself. The gift is whole from the beginning. Or put another way, it knows no beginning or end. There's no beginning to the gift. All is gathered, all is compassed, all is perfected in Christ. Christ is all in all, as the phrase goes. All is of him, and all is as he is. And then continues. He bore within himself the natural logoi of all visible and intelligible beings, together with the incomprehensible forms of thought proper to his divinity. Now, forms of thought here, or even incomprehensible, translate the Greek word noemata. Our translator helpfully informs us. Noemata just means the phrasings or the formations or the figurations of the nous. It's what the nous does. And so we see here that the nous, or the intellect, is blessed with form from its genesis. We're not seeking formlessness. We seek to correspond with these forms, as it were, these figures, as it were, but they're only given for us in terms of their transformation or transfiguration. So transformation, transfiguration is proper to the nous insofar as we are able to be with Maximus here. And then a little bit further down, 5 lines up from the bottom. Moreover, insofar as the Logos is a teacher of the spiritual logoi that exist in both visible and intelligible realities, he gives to those who are worthy. Right? He gives to those who are worthy, as if it were flesh to eat, the true understanding of the logoi. So he gives understanding to the worthy. Worthiness seems to precede understanding here. So worthiness is not superiority of mind. Well, it's certainly, obviously, clearly not. Also, the revelation is that human worthiness is synergetic. It's not of our own, it's of our union with God. And then he says, he gives to those who are worthy the true understanding of the Logos found in visible realities in a manner that is appropriate to the recipient and consistent with reason, with the Logos. So each gift is one's own. Each one's own is uniquely unto his own. And so we need to approach each other's gifts with the awe, the reverence proper to uniquely formed creation. Let's hold that in mind too, and press on just to read the last question and response and a few thoughts, and then open it up to conversation. David, go if you will please. Question 36, beginning 215 over to 217.
Question 36. What are the bodies and the blood of the irrational animals that the Jews used in their worship? What are they? And why did they eat only the bodies, but not the blood, which later they poured out in a circle around the altar sacrifice? The response: those who of old worshiped God according to the shadow of the law were a figure of those being initiated into piety, although they themselves were barely able to understand the external ordinances of the symbolic figures. But inasmuch as the law was not principally given to them, but to us, in whom it was spiritually perfected according to Christ, let us examine with piety the inner logic of these sacrifices. The beginner who is being initiated into piety, being instructed in the works of righteousness, engages solely in practical activity in all obedience and faith, nourishing himself on the outward appearances of the virtues as if they were flesh. There's a scholia. By outward appearances of the virtues, he means instructions in morals. Back to the main text. But the inner principles of the commandments, in which is found the knowledge of perfect things, he surrenders to God in faith, being unable to extend himself to the magnitude of knowledge. This is because the altar of sacrifice is a symbol of God, to whom we all make spiritual sacrifices, surrendering our knowledge of things beyond our powers, so that we might live. The altar's pedestal, on the other hand, is a figure of faith in God, for faith is the foundation supporting the entire edifice of divine things, works, and forms of thought. And it is to this foundation that everyone turns who is not able to enjoy the strong drink of the chalice of God's wisdom with temperance and the cognition of the knowledge of things beyond his reach. And such a person does well in pouring out the inner principles before the altar. That is, in surrendering to faith the knowledge of those inner principles that are beyond his powers to grasp. Thus, inasmuch as the ancient people were a figure of those being initiated into piety, they ate the flesh of the sacrifices, but the blood they poured out around the pedestal of the sacrificial altar, being unable, on account of their infantile way of thinking, to grasp the mystical knowledge of what was taking place. And there's a Scholia 2. Here, according to contemplation, he understands blood to mean knowledge, since knowledge nurtures the body of the virtues. The main text. But when Christ appears as a high priest of the good things to come, sacrificing an ineffable sacrifice, he offers himself and his blood, together with his flesh, to those whose faculties of soul have been trained to distinguish good from evil. For the one who is perfect, having worked his way not simply to the rank of those being initiated, but to the rank of those who are advancing, is not ignorant of the inner principles of his actions, undertaken according to the commandments. On the contrary, having first spiritually consumed these principles by means of his actions, he eats the entire flesh of the virtues, raising up the motion of his perceptible actions to the level of spiritual knowledge. There are many other interpretations of these things, which are especially appropriate to you who love God supremely. But on account of their great number, let us for now leave them aside.
You're muted.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, David. Let's think for a minute here. The themes seem to be flesh and the blood, and appropriate action or appropriate kinesis. Concretely, it's about community. It's about how a community makes sense of the gift. And here, it's how a community makes sense of the gift, a community that is in time, but not as or of time necessarily. So again, this is not an historical inquiry and evaluation by Maximus. Now, flesh and blood. Here we find the wisdom of groping enacted. This community knew how to feel basically. Maximus says innocently, right? As a young one. And part of the wisdom of this stance is to leave beyond what is beyond for now. There's not a strong sense of improper haste here. At the bottom of the first paragraph, 36.2, Maximus says, let us examine with piety the inner logic. So inner logic and piety, well, let us examine with piety in the light of Christ, in the horizon of Christ. The inner logic, we know that our logos tends unto his logos. So inner logic here means the movement unto. Is it movement of one's own unto one's own, or is it one's own unto his own? That's what he's asking. Are these sacrifices for ourselves or for him? And then just a little comment on towards the bottom of paragraph 36.4, the last kind of section, 2 sentences where he begins, the one who is perfect, for the one who is perfect, having worked his way. And here, perfection is not defined by finishedness or a sense of something being over. It's still ongoing. He says the advancing. The perfect is in the rank of those who are advancing. This is an image of apophatic kinesis. Maximus is talking about the most basic and the most simple at once, not disdaining either. But also with the word rank, it's a great word. There's a reference. This is a reference to hierarchy, not gradation of value or of love given or of worthiness of divine attention. It's just hierarchy where something fits. Pushing in a little bit closer to paragraph 36.3, just 3 lines. The first line is 3 down, in all obedience and faith, nourishing himself. And the second line is, for faith is the foundation. It's on the next page. And the third line is the inner principles of the commandments, just at the beginning of 36.32. But first, he says, the beginner who is being initiated into piety, being instructed in the works of righteousness, engages solely in practical inactivity, in all obedience and faith, nourishing himself. That's the key phrase. In all obedience and faith, nourishing himself. So faith, I think, and everything we've been saying about faith, clarifies obedience here. We've danced a bit with obedience. We haven't taken it right on because I don't think that we were ready to. Probably not yet, but part of its mystery here is clarified. And they're both faith and obedience, as cast in terms of nourishment. So Maximus is easing us into the deep mystery of these two ideas, these two concepts. Here, obedience means the participation and transformation of one's whole person. And given the sense of Maximus's whole response, both faith and obedience begin with patience, intimate patience and trust, apart from haste, apart from fear. Four lines down on page 216. Maximus says, for faith is the foundation supporting the entire edifice of divine things, works, and forms of thought. We said that faith as a stance or disposition is a form of joyful participation out of which all flows out of that form of joyful participation, that disposition of trusting patience and love. Here also, though, faith does not equal certainty. It means loving openness to the gift of life, a willing joy to perceive and partake of the divine Logos in every place he dances with us, in each beautiful gift of relation. It's that stance which allows our appropriate relation. And then finally, this is just a final thought, and then we can I have a few questions and we can begin there or not. 4 lines up from the bottom of page 215. The inner principles of the commandments, in which is found the knowledge of perfect things, he surrenders to God, being unable to extend himself to the magnitude of knowledge. There's a beautiful footnote there around that phrase, extend himself to the magnitude, that references Gregory of Nyssa and others. But just looking at the first bit of that sentence, the inner principles of the commandments. The inner principles are that which is surrendered as being properly beyond. This is the wisdom of the community. They surrendered these. The inner principle of the commandments. Form always involves an energy, and together form and energy become beautiful. And so the result of a commandment is less significant than how its essential logos or kinesis or energy transforms us as we partake of it. It's the transformation in the partaking that's the heart of it. That's what we seek. And we touched on the phrase inner logic, inner principle. They might even be the same word here. But the inner logic of the sacrifices, the inner principle of the commandments. Maximus is talking about the dynamic at the heart of our forms. He's saying form is blessed, the dynamic is the heart, and that's the transformative part. Let's begin with 3 questions, or we can set them down, we can return to them, but let's pose them. They roughly correspond with the 3 questions. So roughly corresponding with question 36, which we just read. How does Maximus phrase here the meaning of withdrawal, to withdraw? We know that the whole of our being is theosis, the whole of our being is synergy, the whole of our being is drawing near. So what does withdraw mean for Maximus and for us? Second, and loosely connected with question 35, what is the horizon of our spiritual zeal? What is the horizon of our spiritual zeal? And then third, roughly corresponding with question 34. If our formation is ongoing and our true kind of mode of being is transformation, not deformation, transformation, how do we bless synergy in our formation? How, when we are seeking our struggle, when we're seeking to form ourselves to be receptive, how do we bless synergy in that? In other words, how are we able to be open to or leave room or love or have the capacity for the transformation of our own self, which is always beyond us a little bit. So let's begin there with one of these questions, or at another point in the text which we might like to take up.
I'd like to linger a little bit more over 36, question 36. Just several things that are striking about it to me. This matter of flesh and blood, and in Jewish disciplines around kashrut, around how you treat animals. And this is also true for for Muslims. They make a lot of this. They make a lot of it. I mean, even in a place like Edmonton, where the Jewish community is quite small, there are only a couple of places where Jews and Muslims, and they can both go to these places. I don't know what they're doing at the moment, given the struggles, and get kosher meat. Kosher meat comes to be when a rabbi, or along with a shukot, along with a ritual slaughterer, prepare the animal in a proper way. There's prayers of blessing. Then the animal is killed in a very particular way, and they are bled. All of the blood must come out of the body of the animal. And I had never, of course, made the connection between this till I read this. And in the temple cult, so this is an echo of the temple that still exists. Because in a sense, the world is a altar. And it's also, you talked about symbol a bit. It's also a way of connecting to and it comes to your question here about withdrawal. Blood is withdrawn from the flesh and poured out. It is a mystery beyond measure. Life is a mystery beyond measure. And so is death. And so intimately so when we are nurtured by the death of other flesh. So this sense that, and this ritualization, that there is coursing through the veins of all life that itself is something we can only be present to in awe and wonder. So withdrawal. When you are in the presence of that which is ineffable, or even if it isn't ineffable, it's beyond what we understand. Then regard it, but don't try to get your mind around it and strangle it. That is to remove yourself from the very wonder that courses through the veins of the world. I was also struck by his reference here about faith as a pedestal of the altar. And I don't know because I've never studied it. I don't know how much is known about this. But I do know that in our tradition, when it is properly practiced, and this is not something that is often seen, I've seen it once in my life. And we, of course, don't have an altar. We have a holy table. This holy table is ritually constructed. And when we look at the most thorough way in which this is described and the rubrics for it, what is meant to occur is that there is a tree, you can call it a post if you want, which is buried deep in the ground and comes up through the ground. And on that is constructed without nails the altar, the holy table. There is a sense in that the Orthodox holy table is a womb and a tomb and a table. All three are there. And the construction of it is a prayer. It's a liturgy. And it is, of course, anointed, the way in which a baby is washed, the way in which kings are anointed, the way in which people are anointed when they go into battle with oil, and the way in which the holy myrrh-bearing women came to anoint Jesus Christ in the tomb. And it is also dressed that way. The first cloth is a swaddling clothes. I don't know that I remember these all correctly, but there's a swaddling clothes that are placed over it. And there is the cloth, which is the table cloth for when the disciples, having talked with the stranger about what had happened, sat down at the table in Emmaus, and at the breaking of the bread, they realized what they were saying. And then there's the cloth that Christ's body and the body of everyone who dies is wrapped in. And of course, this is mimicked. I hope mimic is a good word. Maybe it's a bad word, but it must be a good word in its origins. This is also replicated in the discus and the chalice, the discus with the star over it and the cloth over it. So this way of building this notion up is, which he refers to here in the ancient altar, is there in the holy table as well. And in all of them, I suppose, each one of them is simply laying before us the logoi of our being and the logos, and how it's incarnate and is everywhere present and fillest all things. So you said, Andrew, in your remarks about 36, to leave beyond what is beyond. And my sense is that that's key to this question you've asked about withdrawal. And it seems to me it is profoundly attended to. It's obviously symbolized, but I mean, it's attended to in both how Jews, given the law, deal with animals, the blood being poured out before the altar. And there are no words for it then, no words. There's the prayer of thanksgiving in the midst of it, but no words beyond that.
No words, but if I may just push you a little bit, but there's still something that is being partaken of. There's still something happening there. And so it's not that words only serve us here and then after it's better after. It's that there's not appropriate way to commune
The
then
appropriate
in
way,
that.
the appropriate way is that the word is made flesh.
Mhm, mhm.
It's made flesh in
Transformed, transfigured.
you deal with the flesh, and it's also made flesh in the altar itself, and the pedestal is face. The pedestal is this disposition, attending to, regarding how altar, table, tomb, how birth, communion in life, the entrance into the eternal, how all of those are layered on each other. They all are infleshed.
And in those two events, actions, things you gave us, what we see is not a negation, but a transformation of a gift unto new life. That's really beautifully put.
And in wonder.
And in wonder and awe, as you say, as Maximus says, yeah. The participation in that transformation. That's the dynamic of the law, or of the inner logic of the sacrifice.
I think you were right at one point to distinguish between the ineffable and an event that it might not be categorically wordless, but it's beyond. It has an apophatic aspect, and that sentiment seems to underlie the generous view that Maximus has. Well, at the end of question 36, since we're looking at question 36 right now, Maximus suggests that there are many other interpretations or many other logoi, and then he suggests that we leave those aside on account of their great number, and that recalls that the halfway through question 35, after delivering this exquisitely fraught and challenging interpretation of the blood and flesh and bones of the ultimate sacrifice, he then begins to suggest other ways that people might have other interpretations that people might occur to people. And it's not it's not an invitation to a free for all. Obviously, he takes some pains to suggest other reasonable ways of discussing the same thing, and I think that's important. Presumably, this would be an unending exercise, and it wouldn't. I mean, exercise is slightly facile way of putting this. I just wanted to mention that in passing, but I was quite taken. We're somewhat alienated, not simply as Christians, but as modern people who eat meat and aren't usually close to the slaughter of animals. And it is quite an awesome spectacle. And it's one thing going to receive meat that is being drained of blood for if one is a Muslim or one is Jewish. And it's another thing actually to witness the slaughter. And it recalls to me so one occasion when I was in Cairo for quite a long time during Ramadan, and afterwards there's an important feast. And for several days, animals, even downtown Cairo, not too far from, say, Tahrir Square, are tethered every several blocks. And it's kind of, I have a bit of a soft spot when it comes to animals. Being a city boy, not, raised on a farm. It's not something to brag about, of course. And I knew what the fate of these animals were, and it was and I made a point of not going out or during the time when I know the sacrifice would occur. But later, it's unavoidable. You go out and in the heat of Cairo, and there's a lack of water, so people don't clean the streets, and you can see the event through the where the animal was sacrificed, and from the progress of the blood trail, not unlike watching a bullfight when the bull is gored. Sometimes it's what's most horrific is how long it takes for the bull finally to die. It might go halfway across the stadium, and the same thing, some you knew that a goat was tethered at a particular block, and then halfway down the block, you see the blood still trailing in great volume, and then the blood from different sacrifices trails out onto the the side of the road, and it travels down, and in the heat, it creates for the next few days a horrific stench, such that you really can't in certain places even walk on the sidewalk. You have to walk in the middle of the road, making your way past cars. And the only reason why I bring this up, because it's easy to forget not only what a precious thing life is symbolized by blood and all that's contained in blood, information as well as vital things that we're in awe of, and that biology still can't begin to really do anything more than quantify in a similarly distant way. And so when you see that which is emanating from life blood, and it has been sort of spent, as it were, there's both an initial awe, of course, and then a kind of grotesque, acutely and sustainedly grotesque aspect, which is probably also important because of that which is precious is has been. I can almost understand why there's this tradition of draining blood, because there is something I'm sort of fumbling over my words right now, not to suggest that it's ineffable, but the grotesque is often a sign of that which brings us up against our horizons, and if we're attentive, can help us work through our horizons and think about things that we ordinarily don't want to think about. And so I'm not really sure where I'm exactly going with this, but there is probably something awkwardly and uncomfortably salutary about witnessing these kinds of spectacles if we have the opportunity. But it's not a pleasant thing to witness, and that might speak to aspects of the ineffable value of that which comes with any sacrifice, certainly one that is so tangible, concrete. And just to this is really a kind of horribly banal, maybe trite thought, but even when one's not vegan or vegetarian, I'm not, as it happens. If one cooks a steak, you obviously want to let it, after it's been cooked, sit for 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how thick it is, because otherwise when you cut it, the blood just leaves, and it's a kind of a unnecessary waste, and it diminishes what you're eating. And that also, in some way that people probably can connect with, but no one wants to think about this, of course, when you're consuming a sacrifice, which is what all of our meals are, is something we should probably think about, but not in a not to chastise ourselves, but just to think further.
Yeah.
And thinking further, of course, is a part of what Maximus is talking about in all matters that are ineffable, over certainly something as important as the sacrifice, because the transformation of the concept of sacrifice for Christians is something that is exponentially beyond us, even more so than these metaphorical, concrete sacrifices that have been put aside or overcome in a sense by symbolic Christian communion, which also involves a different form of sacrifice, arguably even more. I'm saying this in the way that Paul approaches the idea of the resurrection, almost infinitely more grotesque. I mean, beyond our horizons, something that we can't grasp, something terrible, but simultaneously intensely hopeful and life-giving.
Let me see if I can't. I really like how both of you are thinking here. In the sense that it's rich and wonderful. Let me poke each of you a little bit, maybe. This idea of sacrifice and all of the meaning and the clarity of it. How is sacrifice like prayer? I want to relate this to question 34. When Maximus says, when we pray, what are we doing? What are we expecting? What are we presuming? In the way that you each have just spoken about the regard involved in approaching the event or the act or the reality, the thing of sacrifice, it seems holy, that regard given by each of you. That kind of regard, how does it color or texture our sense of prayer? And sacrifice, as each of you have just kind of articulated, as Maximus does too, it's not about certain result. There's something deeper and more profound going on there. It's about a kind of transformation, ultimately. So, heading back to question 34, what does this discussion of sacrifice illuminate about the idea of prayer? And Maximus is striding beyond the idea that prayer is a request that we can be certain will be fulfilled if God loves us enough. Like that kind of crude, strange way of considering prayer. But how does it echo in both of your minds?
I can see David ruminating. I have a quick thought, maybe not that thought when it's not simply automatic and it's not simply assertive when it's there's a synergistic underlying aspect when it's thought in some kind of communion, which arguably all thought beyond the most kind of ordinary automatic thought or assertive thought is, I think, a form of prayer and doesn't as such. I mean, I'm not trying to foreclose on the idea of prayer, obviously, but this just occurs to me in light of our previous discussion. Does entail an aspect of sacrifice. If thought is a kind of union with like faith, an unmediated union with God, so a form of synergy, then it might, as you were saying earlier, represent a kind of correspondence with the logos. But there's also something else, since we're not well, okay, I might okay, I'll just say it. What I'm saying is probably inconsistent with things that I was thinking earlier, that we were thinking about earlier. But so I'll just reiterate what I was saying, that there is this aspect of thought that does entail a sacrifice. And why I'm struggling is because it's a sacrifice of something in us, but it's also something that is a pre-existing union, a kind of harmony with that is so what's being sacrificed is maybe what already stood outside of the harmony. I have sort of background, strange thoughts that I'm kind of also suppressing, because there is also this cliche idea that I guess, I might as well bring it out on the table openly, but it's not exactly what we're talking about, that the virtue of scientific hypothesizing is that you can extend ideas out into the world rather than yourself. And so you don't need to die 1,000 times. You can use thought to find your way in the world. But I think that's a slightly trite way of approaching what prayer approaches. So I didn't want my thought to totally be subsumed by that standard, almost cliche thought.
If
No, but
I,
just to
go
sorry,
ahead.
just to follow very quickly, Michael. No, you don't. We don't want to think of prayer or thought as something that is safe for us to do, that we can, take back if need be. But that's also the kind of prayer that Maximus is responding to here. The kind of thing, well, I don't have anything. Give me something I want. I'll be over here. Oh, thank you. It's extraordinarily crude, as you say, but it is kind of maybe good to recognize that that is fairly common and a temptation often for everybody. Pardon me, David.
Yeah, I appreciate what you were working at expressing there, Michael. I have sometimes had conversations with people who want to discuss some theological matter, and they might even want to know what the Christian East thinks about it, and they think maybe I know what it thinks about it. And so they will call me, or they'll come over and sit and chat. And I always am touched by this, because there's an eagerness in it. And that eagerness is, it's something that, it touches me. But as you were thinking, these conversations came to mind. And no matter what it is that one is talking about, I mean, it can be, in a way, the most sacred of things. Sometimes what happens is, even though I do not try to contribute to this, what I end up saying, because I view all such conversations as conversations. We're going to talk about something. I'm not going to give you information. So that's the way I try to approach it, although God knows sometimes I don't. But sometimes what happens is, all of a sudden you realize you thought you were thinking with somebody, and all of a sudden it became an information mining operation. And that always makes me really, well, mildly uneasy. And then the other side of it, any really good thinking that certainly I have ever been a party to, have been a part of, hasn't been mine. It's been ours. And there's been something in it that has arisen. And in that sense, it's always been, you pointed to the sacrifice part of it. There's always, and I'm often reminded of the word sacrifice means, to make sacred, to participate in the sacrality of something. So when thought actually arises, I think it's fair to say this. It has a couple of features to it, and one of those features is what Andrew raised in his one question here, is and what Maximus talks about. You come to a certain point where you just hold it. You don't go any farther. You let it be, because it is speaking. It's a word. And to go farther is to make it something else. So, I think, thought is like all other aspects of our life. Communion may arise there and be given. And that's really thought. Now, there are many people who have such remarkable intellectual capacity, and I just marvel at it. And I don't know what to say about that. But at least in my life, in conversation with someone, and sometimes it happens here when we're talking together, that there is a gift of that takes some form between us. And that is prayer. What is, I've been in a lot of liturgies in Orthodox churches in a variety of places. And I want to be careful how I phrase this. There's a huge difference, it seems to me, when you are in a liturgy where those who are with us, serving with us, the royal priesthood, when the ordained clergy, with all of their vestments and all of their carefully articulated gestures and all of those words which we hear every time and hopefully hear them new every time. But there's a huge difference with people who perform the liturgy. And when you suddenly are in the presence of somebody who's actually praying it. And when they're praying it, and I don't presume to really know this. I just know that sometimes I experience it as being caught up in the prayer that somebody is giving here. And that is very much like the Shakut, who has the task of killing and draining the blood from the chickens, and does it in the state of awe. And that's because there's always a withdrawal in it. That is, it isn't me doing it, or somebody like our friend Vedika Lazar. When he is praying the Eucharistic prayers, and raising the air above the gifts, you hear tears. You hear tears because he's in the presence of something. So it's and if you just read the liturgy, if you just read it, if you've never heard it before, like I've read it sometimes to people who've never heard it before. It's an amazing, startling poem. Makes your hair stand on it. But it's the case that, and Maximus is speaking about this, some people do it because they think they get something out of it, instead of opening themselves to the presence of it. There's been liturgical reforms in the Christian East and in Catholicism, and I'm sure you're aware of these, both of you. There was a time, not all that long ago, 50 years ago, depending on where you are. Sometimes it still takes place, I think, where many of the most pious people would not come to communion, to have communion. And the way in which this was usually framed is that people thought they were unworthy. Now, that may be true, and they may indeed be unworthy. But my sense is that we've kind of gone in another direction, and now it's kind of routine. And I mean, not all of it is necessarily routine, but I mean, to listen to attend to pray the liturgy and not be at the cross and not be at Gethsemane and not be in the tomb and not be the women seeing its emptiness is in a way to make it something. To think it's something you need instead of realizing it's something you are. So I have known several priests who are so present to the liturgy that I think you'd have to work hard to resist being present to it, as opposed to what it often is like, which is you have to really work hard to be present to it because it's being done as if it's some kind of performance. But I mean, that's the place where, you know, the heart of our initiation, and where we also seek to be cultivated in our capacity to experience that everywhere, including when we're thinking with people, because it's all about communion. It's all about our logoi being drawn into and dancing with the logoi of others and of the life of the world. Am I making any sense?
Well, David, that's nicely said. I want to respond with kind of in two ways, both of which I'd like you to address, Michael too. When you were talking about worthiness just there at the end, and the question of communion, am I worthy, am I not? That seems to be the spiritual inflation of unworthiness. And then, as you said, the routine kind of thoughtless habit, witless habit is also inflation.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure you've heard the same line from Vladika Lazar, but when Vladika Lazar talks about, Archbishop Lazar talks about the liturgy sometimes, and there are prayers that say, no one is worthy to, and so on, or those who are worthy to. And he says, it's one of his beautiful, it's a beautiful expression of his whole being. But he says, if we look at it this way, of course no one was worthy. But of course everyone is worthy. Because we're all fall short of the glory of God, but Christ's redemption is for all of us. And so this question of worthiness or unworthiness is not one to get kind of fixated on and think that we know for ourselves. It's something beyond us. It's part of the kind of, well, it's part of this other part. At a lecture at the monastery a while ago, George Papadimitriou, I remember, said the Greek word for prayer is very close to the Greek word for attentiveness, very close. It's like prosophy and prosophy, right? So prayer, and David, I love that you brought out, I was hoping you would, the sacrifice is to render sacred, right? In other words, to be present to the sacrality of the event or the thing or the person with which one is drawn near. Prayer as attentiveness, prayer is also that kind of affirmation of the godliness, of the sacredness of that which we are. It is a drawing near to that which is worthy, which is that which is divine, which is all of creation. Prayer and attentiveness. So Saint Sophrony characterizes different kind of concentrations of prayer, but the highest form, he says, is rapt attentiveness to the divine. We know attentiveness is not it's not still, it's still a drawing near. And I like to think sometimes, I mean, one has to be careful because one has to be alert to idolatry at every stage. But David's idea of presence is very, very strong, a very strong icon, let's say, for what we're talking about here, because the PRE of it implies a meaning unto. It's like movement unto the essence. And in Greek, the word is more like that. The Greek word for presence, parousia, is ousia's essence, and parousia, that which attends the essence. And so, David, your notion, I just want to push a little bit because I think we've danced with it the whole seminar, and we will continue to. But there's insight there. This idea of presence, of being present to, being unto the other person, seems to be the ethos both at the heart of sacrifice and of worthiness and of prayer. This fundamental giving of oneself unto the other in intimacy here, but not confining. As you also say, David, leaving the mystery beyond, if it is beyond. We're not trying to colonize or to confine or to, circumscribe. But we're there, we're pressing into, we're there. It comes out in what you say, I think, but I'd like to see how either of you respond to that kind of pushing a little bit.
I like the word insight. This notion that one is beginning to see something. And so that's another way of thinking about how when prayer arises or when thought arises, that one is coming into sight of something. One's being drawn towards some kind of light. And it has a wonder to it.
The idea of unworthiness is a kind of, it's sort of related to a sense of one's fragility, but it's also different. So I don't know if that
Go on.
yeah. Well, I'm thinking there is a kind of moment of a rather rare moment in Homer's epics, in particular in the Odyssey, when Odysseus, ironically, in the guise of someone else pretending to be a beggar, draws close to one of the conspicuously, well, they're all unworthy suitors who have been ransacking his palace, trying to manipulate his wife into marriage and abusing the sacred principle of hospitality, sort of turning it inside out, as it were. And at one, in a fairly famous speech, he he draws close to one of the young suitors who seems to be less unworthy than the others, and tries to impress upon him the fragility of being human. And this young suitor has fallen to this horrendous situation from which he's, as it turns out, it's not going to escape. And he offers him some advice in what is kind of a philosophical, existential speech. It starts off something in the order of man is the frailest of all creatures that roams the earth, and we seem to be um, prayerful. We're not in a moment of we're radically alienated from the divine and from any notion of being a human being in some other sense than just being frail. And this is at the core of our fragility when things are going well. And then there's this wonderful phrase. I'm just going to quote it. I realize this is a little bit of a side from our readings, but it just occurred to me
Maximus
because
knew Homer.
well, it invokes a word. It kind of came to mind. I kind of scrambled for it when I heard David talking about nous earlier. Anyway, so I'll just quote the phrase. And our minds, this is Odysseus speaking to this young suitor who's deeply moved by what he hears, but and he's in a state of the divine is present to him, but it's a tragic um, conception of the divine. Athena, he upon hearing what I'm about to read, decides that he has to separate himself from all of the other unworthy suitors. But Athena holds him fast, so that's his fate. He won't be able to, even though he has desire and seems to have come into is in a moment of synergy, but there is no escape for him. So here are the two lines that um, our minds are as the days are dark or bright, blown over by the Father of gods and men. And the word for minds, as I've looked it up in the Greek, is nous. And it really is a poignant thought because it's sort of hovering between a, a fragility that you know to my way of thinking anticipates by almost 3 centuries Socrates' optimistic notion of being radically self-sufficient, a notion that would feed into Stoicism, that as long as when he's entertaining his friends after he's been condemned to death and he's taken the hemlock and his muscles are getting heavy, and he not in a trivial way, but he starts almost joking about the afterlife, saying that either it will be a place where he can harass the other shades about the nature of justice or what have you, or it'll be a state of nothingness. Those are the options that he provides us. And it seems to me that Odysseus is expressing a more profoundly, trying to think of a better word, but profoundly religious, philosophical, existential insight when he describes Nous as something that isn't that which we self-sufficiently can control amidst the vicissitudes of life. It's also a gift. And when it's the opposite of being in a state of synergy is when the gods conceived by Odysseus can just in a moment just blow it away into nothingness. It's a terrible moment, but it underpins I think the most human moment Odysseus experiences in this epic, because he's always playing his cards close to his vest and deceiving others, and even frustrating Athena when she comes upon him and he tries to deceive her. But this seems to me a moment of insight.
Hmm.
Michael, if you,
Sorry.
oh, sorry, David, pardon me.
I only meant to just highlight that word you used, which was vulnerability. And in my little screed on the liturgy and how that unfolds, all I, whether it's people feeling they're unworthy, or whether it's people being whether it's done in a little more prophylactic way. All I meant to say is that it seems to me that both those are not where it's at. Where it's at is, this is being in the presence of body and blood. And that body and blood is the body and blood of a Jew from Nazareth. The fullness of the human nature, and it's our body and blood. So it just seemed to me going to communion is as vulnerable a place as you can ever go. So prayer, I mean, that's why one is called to go in presence to it. Not in any other way.
Michael, I was gonna ask if you could please reread those two lines.
Yeah.
And also give the
I
reference,
will.
because
Emily Wilson has translated the Iliad, and I expect she probably did a better job with that effort. I sort of try to warn my students off of using her translation for the Odyssey. But I'll read the lines. But just before I do, there are a few alternatives to translating Nous. T.E. Lawrence, rather flamboyantly in his prose translation, translates it, our minds, as something, he translates Nous something like agency. I don't think he's entirely wrong to do so, and it adds something. Emily Wilson somewhat bewilderingly translated it as mood, and I think that's wholly inadequate. Robert Fitzgerald simply uses mind, minds. So our minds, our nous, are as the days are dark or bright, blown over by the Father of gods and men. Zeus, in other words.
That's nice. But let me quibble with your disagreement with mood. Mood is a very good word. If you, in its origins and in its first use, it means a blending of mind and emotion, or rather kind of nous and passion. So it doesn't mean something that just is here and then gone. It is kind of, it is more or less an enacted stance of a human being. If that's what she meant, that's not bad for nous. But if it's just mood as in what I feel strongly now, yeah. But mood's a rich word. It's a rich word.
It's a rich word. I think in this context, though, I think it forsakes an important point that Odysseus is trying to convey to this suitor, and it undercuts the whole irony. He's trying to bequeath to him just a semblance of irony in this tragically closed situation where there's no possible exit for any of the suitors, including um, the young man Antiphomos, whom he's Amphinomos rather, whom he's um, trying to give these words of advice to. And the irony, of course, is that this is why I think T.E. Lawrence was onto something, even though it's a slightly odd
Different
word.
word.
But
Different word.
it's a different word, but I like it because I think it looks forward, and I like to think that Homer had some genius to think of nous as close to agency, but this is totally anachronistic, of course. But there is the irony that his agency that he's attempting to exercise in the presence of in the state of communion with Odysseus, because I think Odysseus is really, as much as someone can come to a moment of communion that's represented by our notion of our Savior's resurrection, the heart of that is an idea of forgiveness and possibilities that are beyond our comprehension for those who otherwise seem to be fragile and trapped the way even animals can't be. So at this moment when Amphinomos seeks to exercise his agency, he's touched by what Odysseus, this beggar, has told him. He doesn't know that it's the master of the household who has returned and is about to annihilate every last person. He reluctantly, in this case, he's bound by Athena, and so I think in this case, a fairly straightforward translation. Our minds, it's probably not so bad. I could get the rest of the verse. I've got Emily Wilson's translation. Do you want me to just take 1 minute, or is it too much of an aside?
If you'd like to, do it.
Let's read a
Okay,
bit of
just
Homer
I'm
at the
sorry,
end.
I
Yeah.
can't remember her what she says, but just bear with me for 30 seconds.
David, when you say disposition of the mind, what do you mean by mind there? Because I've known you long enough. I mean, you've used this phrase for a long while, and it's nice, it's good, but you don't mean just mental. You don't mean abstract at all.
No.
So deepen that sense a little bit, because what a word is invested with, or not invested with, but its lived kind of content is as important as so what do you mean by mind there? I mean, we're talking about nous, and clearly you mean, or nous is there
Well,
with that.
I mean the noose that's descended into the heart,
Nous, yeah, the mind.
which picks up on your notion of mood,
Mm-hmm.
but it also picks up on Michael's reference to T. Lawrence, I guess, and the notion of, what was the word he used?
Well, I could grab that translation too, but he uses uh, I think he might even use the word agency, but I can't
Use
remember
the word
the
agency,
whole
but the
produce.
problem,
I
and
could
and that
dig it
in
out, but I'd be testing your patience beyond reason. Emily Wilson, the other thing is she gives a slightly compressed, she takes a slightly longer passage because I've looked it up in the Greek and compresses it into a single line, which I think is
Give us
bewildering.
the
It's one
Greek and then give us the English. Read the two
I,
lines
I
in
don't
Greek.
um
Oh, shucks. Okay,
okay,
not to worry, not to worry.
I could get the Greek too, but instead of two lines, which is it is in the Greek, we get one line. Our mood depends on what Zeus sends us. Or okay, our mood depends on what Zeus sends each day. That's it.
Hmm.
Um, well,
Wow,
I think it's a little
just Latin
deflating.
with it, huh?
And our mood in used in that sentence that I just read out, I
That's
don't
poorly
think
done.
captures the richness that Andrew was
It's poorly
suggesting.
done. But Michael, read in your favorite translation. How long is the speech? Just out of curiosity, 10 lines, 50 lines?
Oh, well, the whole speech
The whole
is
speech.
probably about 40 lines, something like that. I'm not sure.
Why don't we conclude with
30
this?
lines.
Why
Yeah.
don't, if you will, read it out. Just read it out. Let's listen to this partly because what we're doing here with Maximus' question and answer is trying to discern how narrative gives us something that kind of plainly argued ideas don't. And so this kind of thing, Homer is, as you say, and as you've said more than once over the years, Homer is richer than he's the one of the maybe the richest Greek voice possible. And so his way of telling a story in a way holds together, encompasses, says a lot about what follows that we've dwelt with more explicitly. So if you will, please.
I should probably get the Greek, but I'll just for those two lines, but I'll I'll read okay, the whole speech from Odysseus. Amphinomos, your head is clear, I'd say, as was your father's, or at least I've heard good things of Neos and Dulikoion, whose son you are, they tell me, an easy man. And you seem gently bred. In view of that, I have a word to say to you, so listen. And then this famous speech. By the way, it's a counterpart to the Danos speech in Antigone. The wonders are many, but nothing so wondrous as man. It's kind of a foil. Of mortal creatures, all that breathe and move, earth bears none frailer than mankind. What man believes in woe to come, so long as valor and tough knees are supplied him by the gods? But when the gods in bliss bring miseries on, then willy-nilly, blindly, he endures. Our minds are as the days are, dark or bright, blown over by the Father of gods and men. So I, too, in my time thought to be happy, but far and rash I ventured, counting on my own right arm, my father and my kin. Behold me now. No man should flout the law, but keep in peace what gifts the gods may give. I see you, young blades, living dangerously, a household eaten up, a wife dishonored, and yet the master will return, I tell you, to his own place and soon, for he is near. So may some power take you out of this homeward and softly, not to face that man. The hour he sets foot on his native ground between him and the suitors, I foretell no quittance, no way out, unless by blood, once he shall stand beneath his own roof beam. I think, you know, the for a Greek audience listening to, the hairs on their neck would be standing up, knowing that this beggar is actually Odysseus speaking, and knowing how grotesquely hellish the retribution is, you know, even for the disloyal female servants who face a rather horrendous fate. But every last suitor is, well, there's exception made for one, perishes at the end, and
Is
it's
that
quite striking.
whose
Yeah,
translation is that?
this is Robert Fitzgerald's
That's
translation.
Fitzgerald. I thought so. Yeah.
And Michael, you said this is one of the moments of almost presence or almost kind of forthcomingness in Odysseus or in the, in Homer. You know Homer well. What's Homer revealing here about, because Odysseus is the fullest of all. He's the fullest of all. I mean, James Joyce made this claim absurdly historically, but he's the fullest of all. He's a full man, like Shakespeare's father.
I mean,
Take him for
you
all
know,
in
that
all.
what I'm about to say may seem a little kind of well inflated, let's say, but Amphinomos, because Amphinomos isn't a very important character, although he is singular in that he's one of the few young men who has come to prey upon Odysseus' household, who seems to be well bred and decent, and Odysseus has some feeling for him. Unfortunately, Athena takes another view. But it seems to me that Amphinomos, even though he's um, not a significant character, has a moment of this brief, fleeting revelation in communion with Odysseus in one of the few moments when Odysseus is interested in conveying, providing forgiveness to the suitors. And the other great moment that comes to mind is one of the rocketing moments of the Iliad. The Achilles, the greatest warrior in the Iliad, who's also doomed to die. He's inescapably also going to die. Begins the Iliad by withdrawing his services when he's disrespected by Agamemnon, and Briseis is taken away from him in a hugely lawless act. But later, when he's in the tent, and King Priam steals his way through the Greek armies and makes his way to Achilles' tent and presents himself in front of this man who's like a lion perched before him, and he manages to touch his heart for just a moment. And Achilles releases himself from his unquenchable rage and has this moment of communion where he's able to not so much forgive King Priam, but recognize that there's a duty that he owes to his dead son, even though he wants to desecrate the body and never forgive him for killing Patroclus. But he nonetheless relinquishes the body, and you could tell it's a fragile, emotionally fragile moment for him in the terrible sense that he he cautions Priam to leave quickly because he knows that he's barely hanging on to this moment where he can exercise some graciousness amidst his rage.
Thanks for that. It was lovely to hear. I mean, there's a lot in that passage that resonates with what we read today in Maximus. It's a remarkable.
I thought I wasn't thinking until you asked.
With withdrawal and communion and presence
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
regard,
remarkable.
and zeal.
I wanted Andrew and we need to finish, I know, but why do you raise the question? What is the horizon of our spiritual zeal? What's in that question for you?
Yeah, it arose from the idea of the eagerness of prayer to ask for that which we are not ready for. I think I'm sure I said in the session before, my favorite stories are all of the desert, and there's a desert father who asked for a gift and he prayed for 7 years and it was given to him. And then he realized that although God had granted his prayer, the gift was beyond him. So he asked for it to be withdrawn from him. And after prayer, it was withdrawn. Right. I remember Lydia Lazar writing a short text called something like "Zeal for Orthodoxy" as something like a holy activity. As in, zeal is not bad. Overreaching, good energy is good, but overreaching or asking for that which we're not ready for. And that seems to be the first question that he asked is, why do we think of prayer as trying to take on something that we're not? Why do we think of it like that? It's not like that. It's never that cut and dry, never that bifurcated. But also, what kind of spiritual foolishness is involved in saying, God, bring me next to you now? It's a bizarre, and so it touches your idea of presumption, I think, a little bit, David, which I think is a really important term. And presumption has the same beginning as presence, but they're different, right? They're different in their essence. Zeal is energy, Enthusiasm, which is another word for zeal, comes from, well, we know this, Homer teaches us this, from being, as it were, inhabited by a god, right? But often we feel that God is with us, but it's only ourselves. And so we hasten here or there. And hence the idea of spiritual inflation being the opposite of simplicity. We often think that because we have this much and this much is so beautiful, it's almost beyond us. We think that we're ready for everything.
Yeah.
If faith in our minds means certainty, then we will talk glibly about anything. And God have mercy, most of us do now. But if faith means patience, intimate patience and groping, and if prayer, as Maximus says, is self-transformation unto receptiveness, and if, as each of you both articulated, sacrifice is not something that is kind of something else has ruined for me, or I just give up something because, but if it is seeking the wholeness, the healing of everything we are by understanding how to draw near, then zeal seems to be transformed. It's not, and synergy transforms our zeal anyways, because often we think, or perhaps we think of zeal as, I can do this, so I will. And often it involves hurrying. We want to hurry to what we see as good.
Yeah.
But that also is making an idol of time. It's saying we don't believe the thief on the tree and what Christ said to him. We don't believe that for Christ, time is not a category. We want to be certain, and then so certainty becomes a form of warding off fear and so on and so forth. But it can be let's say masked as eagerness, but really we're covering up a lack of something else.
Amen.
Amen and amen. Let's pause.